So welcome everyone. It is so fabulous to have you here for the launch of the Ideas in African Politics network and for this fantastic event with brilliant speakers. I join you today from the UK, where I can confirm that contrary to media reports, we're not actually melting, but we do have the hottest event in town with 5 absolutely brilliant speakers. I wanted to say before we get going just a little something about the Ideas in Africa Politics Network. This is basically an inclusive, collaborative group of like-minded people who are really interested in learning more about ideas and ideologies and how they shape African politics. I think probably the one thing that we have in common is that we believe that ideas and ideologies are often underplayed, especially within sort of conventional accounts of Africa, especially political science accounts of Africa, but not limited to that. And we're interested in doing something about that. It's important to say that it's a very big collaborative network. Lots of people have put a lot of work in to make today happen. So I want to say thank you to everybody. And we try and make it as inclusive and participatory as possible. And one of the things that comes along with that is that we would love people's ideas for events. So this is the launch event, and today we'll talk about how ideologies and ideas matter in Africa, but we want to have more events. So if you've got a great event that you think would be brilliant, a great topic, a subject, please do go to the chat, put it in there, and then we can all consider whether that would be the next event for the IDAP network. The other thing I wanted to flag is that we do want this to be a process that brings together people across different cultural, national boundaries, but also across different generations. So we're hoping that this will be something where we can have collaborative and co-authored publications between members in the network and bring people together at workshops and conferences, both by co-organizing panels at major international conferences, but also perhaps organizing our own bespoke workshop and bringing out of that an edited collection of a journal or a book, hopefully at some point in the future. More on that soon. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us. I should say that the speakers today are all brilliant. They're all people whose work has really inspired me. And I should say very clearly at the beginning that I'm a kind of the newbie in the room when it comes to talking about ideas and ideologies. And all the people who are on the panel today are people who've really influenced my own thinking. So it's a great pleasure to introduce them. The way it's going to work is they're all going to speak at the beginning for about 10 to 12 minutes, kind of giving you their pitch about the ways in which ideas and ideologies matter. Then we'll have a discussion within the panel for about 10, 15 minutes between them about their different suggestions and the ways their ideas connect. Then we'll come to you, the audience. Please do feel free to keep your videos on. It's lovely to see that you're all there, and you'll get the opportunity to ask your own questions, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the panel one by one because there's quite a few of them. And it's the first person kicking us off is Toyin Falola, Professor, and Jacob and Francis Sangamosika Chair in the Humanities at the University of Texas at Austin. But he is also, of course, so much more than that. Somebody who's written a vast amount of important work on ideas and ideologies, including key topics like nationalism, but also through his interview series and conversation series, somebody who has brought this knowledge to a much wider audience, creating a public good available to everyone. So I think it's both great and very fitting, Toyin, that you're the first speaker today. Thanks so much, Prof, and over to you.
Thank you, Nick. I must thank you for this initiative, which started as a very brief email, and it grew very rapidly to become what we are celebrating today. And as this initiative continues, part of what, I think you can mute all of them at your end. Part of what I would suggest will revolve around the issue of relevance, how our ideas can generate relevance in different parts of the world, occasionally issues of advocacy, like bigger issues on death crossing the Atlantic, bigger issues of violence, prostitution, in which this organization can create a voice of advocacy. And third, making knowledge accessible to those who are interested in African politics, whether they're in the desert or in the forest or the savannah, recording great lectures. We can hold capsules, seminar-long lectures. You contribute, I contribute, and we make this knowledge available to millions of students and those who are interested. And we should do collaborative conferences, as you mentioned, partnering between various organizations in the North and South. I've been interested in this topic since the 1970s. My initial fascination was about whom I call organic intellectuals, those who did not go to the academy, but they were generating knowledge. And they did a book, what I call Yoruba Political Gurus, how they took indigenous notions, wrapped them into modernity, and began to take indigenous epistemologies, converting them into ideas to transform their spaces. Then I became interested in those who use the medium of the European languages to communicate. And as I accumulate all of this, the ones we try to emphasize are not about those organic intellectuals using local ideas to generate issues around modernity like Samuel Johnson, Kai Rindorf, but we have been more interested in those who use English language, French language to communicate their thought. And I would speak to those who have been using European languages. And on another occasion, we should return back to those organic intellectuals, those who are interrogating this conversation, making use of Zulu, Yoruba, and bearing in mind, especially as in the case of the jihadists of the 19th century, that the ideas remain important today. You cannot understand Nigerian politics without understanding many of the writings of Danfodio that he generated as far back as the late 18th century, but we tend to ignore them. When we turn to our colleagues who use the medium of the English language, one could accumulate what they're saying to what I call counter discourses on resistance and nationalism. And as these ideas spread across the Atlantic, you have Africans in diaspora, African American identity, Jamaican identity. They join the construction of these ideas, focusing on Black uplift, discrimination, marginalization. But there is also an element that we've ignored, how this knowledge, the new ones in the medium of European languages, began to interact with the organic one and producing new forms of internal epistemologies that were fusing the organic with the global, so that some of the ideas we characterize as Africans also owe a great deal to global issues, as in the reformist ideas of Awolowo that became connected with Keynesian ideas and he fused them into how he articulated notions of federalism and reform. In the 19th and 20th century, many of what they were writing about, I've accumulated them under what I call ideologies of self-assertion. Who is an African? Defining Africanity. Writings of Johnson, Kenyatta, Senghor, Blyden. They focus on all these issues. Sometimes we lump them together, but we can also separate them. Cultural nationalism by Blyden, Senghor, negritude, the conversion of cultural nationalism to assertive resistance that you find in the writings of Lumumba and Julius Nyerere, the very combative nationalism drawing from some of what we've attributed to Fanon, but which you see in the writings of Azikiwe and Nkrumah. And there's a zone that we have not fully captured. I call it the transitional moments between organic and the academic intellectuals. And what we find is in that transitional moment, we tend to lump all of them together in ideologies of decolonization. That transitional moment we have not captured. Some of them include the ideas of Garvey, the ideas of Padmore, the ideas of Du Bois, as they created links between organic knowledge, and the most preeminent intellectuals among them is Du Bois. His definition of Africa is what we continue to use. His definition of Africa is what drives teaching Africa in the classroom. And as we leave this transitional moment behind, coming into the independence, post-independence era, we begin to confront ideas of socialism by Nyerere and his Ujamaa, Busia and the non-aligned movement. And after the Second World War, when the academy joined, we began to talk about nationalist historiography and many of these ideas. Post-colonial, we have not interrogated that sufficiently, so that the literature has tilted towards 19th century and colonial. We have not cumulated post-colonial ideas and ideologies represented by the literature on anti-apartheid movement, Mbeki and the African Renaissance, Steve Biko, and ideas of Black lives. In looking at all this, because my time is limited, what are the cumulative achievements over the centuries? Africa as a core center of knowledge and knowledge generation, we have slighted them in the sense that we have not raised this knowledge into classroom status, the use of knowledge for nation building. We have not actually related many of their ideas to concrete policies, political agenda, and the comparative template for development. In that comparative template for development, we focused on the genealogies of capitalism without interrogating so many ideas of indigenous knowledge that is now coming back in South Africa. Where are we now as I speak before you? Decoloniality, Mignolo, Sabelo, we can speak to those. The Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, we tend to see it more as a policy statement without interrogating the ideas and ideologies that they embed. Afropolitanism, Afrofuturism, the hybridity of ideas that fuse the past with the future. Sometimes we tend to disconnect these new ideas of Afropolitanism, Afrofuturism, we tend to disconnect it from Pan-Africanism. And my own argument is that we cannot disconnect them, that one lays a foundation and another speaks of transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for getting us off to a start. And I actually think Afrofuturism would be a great topic for a future show. So maybe we'll do something on that coming up. We're now very lucky to be able to call on Emma Hunter. Emma is the Professor of Global and African History at the University of Edinburgh. She's recently published, or not very recently, but published a fantastic book on Tanzania, which really brings out the intellectual milieu and the ways in which different ideas circulated at the time. And I think is a really great book as an example of what can be done in this area. So Emma, delighted that you're here, and over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Nick, for bringing us all together today. And I'm really honoured to be part of this panel among such wonderful scholars whose work has inspired me in so many ways. And it's really an honour and very humbling to be coming after Professor Toyin Falola, who has led the way in this in so many ways. I've been asked to talk about my work on political thought and the public sphere and the importance of ideas in historical perspective. And I want to think about these things together and to say something about what we gain by taking a historical perspective on ideas, but also why, as others in this panel have written and thought a great deal about as well, why it's so important to think about ideas in relation to the conditions of their production. So as Nick has said, my own research focuses on East Africa and in particular on Tanzania. So my first book, Political Thought in the Public Sphere, which began life 20 years ago, so it feels quite a long time ago, though much less time than when the professor first started working on these themes. That first book was a study of how in the mid-20th century, Tanzanians worked through what they thought political society should look like, and thought about questions like what qualities should a ruler have, how could individuals guard against a ruler becoming too powerful, what did it mean to be free and how could that freedom be protected, what were the rights and duties of a citizen or political subject, what kind of political system, what kind of socialism. We've already heard the professor talk about the Jamaa in Tanzania. And I was interested in how those questions were debated in the middle 20th century, that period of radical change, which saw empires unmade and countries like what was then Tanganyika and now mainland Tanzania claim their place in the world as independent states. And that process of thinking through and arguing over what state and political society should look like was worked through in different ways in different places, in dialogue with transnational arguments and within the context of deeply asymmetrical power relations, both internally within countries and in the global political order. Now, of course, these are questions that many people have thought about and studied before. But as Nick said in the introduction, I was struck by the way that some political histories in particular had downplayed the role of ideas and focused instead on high politics or on the battle for power or on social movements, all of which are very important. But where's the role of ideas in that? And others had focused more on thinkers like Julius Nyerere, whose thought has framed so much of modern Tanzanian history, but also of studies of political ideas in Tanzania in the mid-20th century. So what I was interested in doing was going beyond great individual thinkers into a wider discursive terrain in which ideas were put forward and argued over. And I was influenced in that approach by some of the methodologies which historians of political thought have developed. And of course, there are lots of different ways that we can do this, and some of those different ways are represented on our panel today. Others have used oral history research, others have used techniques drawn from historical linguistics. But in my research, it particularly meant a focus on contemporary written sources, and in particular, an interest in newspapers and periodicals, as well as other published texts, government records, archival records, petitions and letters, so contemporary written sources. And all of these sources present challenges in all contexts, and specifically in colonial and post-colonial contexts. I'll come back to that in a moment. But they also, I think, allow us to hear voices which are often marginalized from intellectual histories, which gravitate towards elites. So why is this important? Well, intellectual historians of political thought have sometimes been accused of antiquarianism, of just being interested in ideas for ideas' sake. But I don't think that's right, and I think everyone in this panel would agree with that. For me, an attention to studying ideas in the past is important, not because it provides a blueprint for the present, which can simply be sort of taken and adopted, but rather recovering ideas which were important in the past provide a resource, an intellectual resource for the present. And I think that's particularly perhaps true at our present time, when it can sometimes feel as though political ideas are in short supply. I'm speaking to you from Sheffield in England, the United Kingdom, where, as Nick says, we are not actually totally melting, although there is, I think, much of the infrastructure is, but we're also trying to choose a new Prime Minister, and or rather, we are perhaps not trying to choose a new Prime Minister, a small number of party members of the governing party are trying to choose a new Prime Minister, and the pitches which the different candidates are putting forward seem to point to that kind of lack of ideas of our contemporary moment. So going back to the past and thinking about ideas which were powerful once, but in the end were not pursued, seems to me to be critically important. And for the middle 20th century, this brings into focus a set of themes which include the problem of empire and what should come after it. And it was far from clear that what should come after it should be a nation state. There were trenchant criticisms of this way of organizing political society. More broadly, big questions about citizenship, which of course my fellow panelist Francis Nyamanjo has written so extensively and so interestingly about. Those questions of who belongs and what it means to be the citizen of a state were hotly contested. It also highlights the importance of different kinds of solidarities, which at times worked with the nation state, and other times we're in conflict with them, including Pan-Africanisms, as well as solidarities smaller than the nation state. Questions too of how to deal with an unequal world. And those questions were often discussed in terms of languages of modernity or in earlier periods of civilization or development. But East African thinkers challenged European, American, or Soviet claims to any monopoly on what those terms should mean. And as I've said already, the question in the 1950s and 1960s of what kind of political order should be instituted. What should democracy look like in an East African context? One party, more than one party, something else again. Again, often challenging normative ideas which departing colonial rulers were seeking to impose. And running through many of these questions were questions of what was freedom, how to achieve it, and its proper limits. All of these questions were tied up with a context of imperialism in the late of the Cold War, but were not reducible to these dynamics. And I think a history going back to looking at ideas in their context helps us to recover those competing ideas and to think about what was eclipsed and when, and the roads not taken. At the same time, it helps us recover genealogies of ideas which were at times eclipsed, but then also resurfaced. And the history of ideas of democracy, tracking those strands through the 20th century, again, is a really interesting way of a really good example of that. And in all these areas, there's so much fantastic historical research going on at the moment, and which has been carried out in recent decades, which is really exciting to see. This is, I think, a really growing and dynamic area of research, and this panel is testament to that. But in all of this, and this is the second point I want to make, I think a particular challenge that we have as historians, which is where I'm coming from, is to understand the conditions in which ideas were put forward and debated and argued over in the past. Specifically, what does it mean for our histories of ideas that those who generated political thinking in the 20th century were often doing so in the context of repressive regimes, first under colonialism and then sometimes in some places in independent states, which radically constrained the space for public debate? So, for example, in Tanganyika, heavy censorship regimes made the development of a significant independent press almost impossible until the 1950s. So how and in what ways, using what methodologies, can we explore political ideas in publications which were sometimes edited and published by agents of a colonial state, or where they were independently published, subject to strict forms of censorship? And more broadly, while we're attuned to economic and political inequalities in the 20th century world, how do we also take account of ideological inequalities in that world? What does this mean for which ideas become powerful and which are marginalized, which voices we don't hear? And so for that reason, and like others on this panel, my work in studying the history of ideas has always gone along with also trying to understand the dynamics of print and publishing in general, and of public spheres in particular, under colonialism and in the years after independence. And I use that term very cautiously, and noting the many problems with the term particularly, and think about this in particular in relation to the history of newspapers and periodicals. Again, I think there's been some really wonderful and important historical work by my many colleagues on this recently, both in terms of how we think about public spheres in a repressive context, but also deep empirical work going into archives to understand how those processes of censorship, but also how those processes of causing ideas to be circulated worked in practice. So it's on my own recent archival research. I've been looking at the ways in which British intelligence services would plant articles in the East African press at particular moments, and some of those files have been released relatively recently and have opened up a kind of window on some of those processes that otherwise remain hidden. So certainly lots more to do in that regard. So to conclude, and I hope I've more or less kept you to time, I just want to join my fellow panelists in really making the case for more histories of ideas and histories of the conditions of production of these ideas. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. That was great. And I think that focus on the pathways not taken is a really great one. You know, the ideas that come to be compelling are not necessarily inherent and inevitable, and reconstructing how they came about is one of the things certainly that I'm most interested in. We now move on to another great speaker. It's really an embarrassment of riches we have for you today, Francis Nyanjo. who is the Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cape Town, but as you all know, is also somebody who's written on a great deal of topics of great importance. Many of you know his work on citizenship and on autochthony. I was lucky enough to read very carefully a recent fabulous book on populism, which he was kind enough to ask me to write the foreword for, and which I strongly recommend to all of you as something that actually takes a look at populism, not from an American perspective and starting from Trump, but from outside America, using insights from Africa and elsewhere to actually provide a very different reading of populism that I thought taught us a lot more than most of the standard text. So Francis, it's a pleasure to have you here, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for making this conversation possible. And I believe it's the beginning of many more such conversations within this network. I thought that I would dwell on, give you a snippet, a sort of introduction to my work around the idea of citizenship and belonging, and what has attracted me to these important issues of our being, and how what framework I use for my research and my conceptualization and approach to reflecting on these issues. I would start first by quickly going back to a point that Professor Falula made at the beginning when he made reference to indigenous epistemologies and intellectuals that we often do not for one reason or another, invite into our scholarly discourses, and the need to revisit them and to see what we could draw on them to enhance our thinking on various issues. And with that, just to say that it's been a deliberate effort on my part in thinking issues of citizenship and belonging to reach out to African popular thinkers and popular ideas of personhood and of relating to draw on inspiration from them. And the first is the sheer proliferation of ideas that we may call popular within the continent that serve as a template for understandings of personhood and citizenship as an enticement for mitigation of the burdens of incompleteness. And if you bother to read in between your scholarly texts, the more serious ones that we use to accompany us in our scholarly journeys, like popular ideas of meaning making, like writings by novelists or by people in society, you would agree that there is a certain proliferation of suggestions, popular suggestions on how we could take seriously the idea of membership and the idea of belonging, more like something that opens up and provides for an emphasis on inclusivity of being rather than the exclusionary indicators. And I always thought that was very suggestive, because it points to a certain emphasis on interconnections, on interdependencies that bring to the fore the idea I found very useful in thinking with the idea of incompleteness. And incompleteness both at the level of an individual and the level of communities and the level of institutions that make us poised to begin the journey of citizenship as an inclusionary pursuit. And in this sense, citizenship is materializes through an ambition to extend ourselves, either as individuals or as communities, either as communities of practice, in the sense of scholarship, and in what we do as scholars of Africa. How can we extend ourselves in disciplinary terms, intellectually, to ask questions in a much more inclusive way that bring us different dimensions of reality in its complexities and nuance. So I found that very useful, that if you think citizenship from the vantage point of an opportunity to mitigate the burdens of incompleteness through mobilizing yourself and mobilization and mobility ourselves as individuals or as collectivities or particular interest that we have, it becomes very productive, and it is something that is constantly unfolding. It is open-ended. It is because through mobility you encounter others, and through those encounters you renegotiate your sense of who you are and your sense of where you belong and how you belong. And that constant negotiation disabuses us of the tendency to freeze citizenship at the primary level and to relate to it as if it was fixed. So it opens up the possibility of contemplating citizenship in composites, and something that is constantly enriched through encounters with others, and it becomes a process of debt and indebtedness in many ways when we meet and exchange with others. It's also a process where we constantly acquire and enrich our technologies of self-fulfillment, our technologies of self-activation. And one author in an African setting that has inspired my thinking in this way is a very unlikely inspiration in the person of Amos Tutuola, and all his writings, fascinating writings on incompleteness. And if you have had time to look at some of what I've written, I have borrowed from him extensively the idea of the skull that becomes the complete gentleman. A skull to fulfill its ambitions begins to borrow and enhance itself to the point where it has acquired all the attributes of being able to temporarily present itself as the most complete possible. But that completeness is always transient. And I think this notion of way of thinking citizenship has been very productive for me. And finally, just to conclude, to say it's premised around the idea of incompleteness and mobility as permanence, the idea of freedom of movement, and means opening up to new avenues of constantly enriching who you are as a member of a community that is not static. And the technologies that we acquire to fulfill ourselves becomes very useful. And With that, I believe you can think all dimensions, various dimensions of citizenship and belonging in a very productive, complex and nuanced way. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Francis. So one of the things I really took from your talk and also from your recent book is the way in which ideas around citizenship are always evolving, never fixed. And I think one of the things that I'm most interested in with this network is also being able to think with you all about how processes like urbanization might further change citizenship ideas moving into the future. There's a great Latin American literature on how that happened, and cities were a cauldron of new forms of citizenship. And I think that that's starting to be done already on Africa, and it'd be wonderful to think through some of those things. So we're now really lucky because we have a fourth wonderful speaker, Shireen Hassim, who is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Politics at Carleton University. She wears many different hats, which I think makes her work particularly rich and interesting for me, as sort of political science, history, gender studies, feminism. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today, Shireen, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks for all the organizing that made this happen. I'm going to exceed the brief you gave me a little bit, and I'm also not feeling very disciplined because I just returned late last night from 2 weeks away. So just cut me off if you think I'm going on too long. Like Emma, I want to talk also about the conditions of knowledge production first, and then I want to get to some of the ideas that have underpinned the incredibly rich scholarship on gender in Africa. A scholarship that, as you will see, I think is under-recognized, undervalued, and particularly so for this distinction between those who do gender and those who do political theory troubles me enormously. But let me just say very briefly something about the conditions of knowledge production. And I want to look at 3 arenas of knowledge production: the universities, social movements, particularly women's organizations and women's movements, and then transnational spaces of activism. And the reason I want to talk about these conditions is because gender research, more so than any, I think, of the other areas we might be talking about today, is intensely political. It is very much rooted in the lives of the women who are taking up the issues, who are writing, who are making theory. And so these conditions really matter. How open have these spaces been in terms of allowing gender scholars, and I'll separate that from feminist scholars for the moment. I'll come back to why that is. How open have these been? In fact, as an academic discipline in the universities, gender studies is relatively new. We were, the earliest work earliest institutional spaces were at Makerere, which had a women and gender studies program, I think long before any other on the continent, and was a really important space for us to think about the nature of politics, of power, of the distributions of power within institutions in Africa. Codestria was also an interesting space in which feminist scholars pushed open spaces quite early on, and many of you will be familiar with the workshops on gender that characterized Codestria's knowledge-making space. But these were very contested spaces. The gender was very much a secondary concern. In fact, I can tell you that when I started working at Wits University, a senior professor asked me why I was doing gender, which was surely, did I not think I was marginalized enough as a woman, for a woman to be working on questions of gender was surely to marginalize myself, and that this was a really bad career move. And I think that was the message most women did get in academia. This is not how you become an academic. But most of the women who did work on feminist issues and gender issues were doing so because they were deeply committed to the movements that were shaping our lives. And so, you know, among the conditions for the production of knowledge about gender, we have to look at what was happening in the organizational space, the mobilizational space, and we have to change the way we think about what is the archive on which theory is built, right? And we have to include in that archive these spaces of pamphlet writing, of internal debate, of the intangible kinds of the ephemera, if I can put it like that, in which ideas were being formed. The third of those spaces are the transnational spaces. And those transnational spaces of activism and thinking, really important in Africa, really, again, underplayed. So I think of the UN decade in Nairobi as one absolutely formative space in which global feminism was transformed, in which there is a challenge to what you might call Western feminism, coming out of African feminists, very important arguments that were made in those spaces that were primarily political, right? But the idea, for example, of thinking about gender as not simply about equality between women and men, but as gender as also involving our ways of thinking about the structure of the economy and inequities in global power really comes to the fore in Nairobi. And for it to come to the fore in Nairobi means there has to have been a long prior discussion, right? That it doesn't come de novo. There's a prior history behind those ideas, which we can only grasp if we take seriously what women were doing in their spaces of organizing against economic disadvantage, against community exploitation of women's unpaid labor, and so on, right? So the conditions change quite interestingly in the 1990s and the 2000s, and I think we now are we have many more women's studies and feminist studies and gender studies programs across the continent. We have a much richer engagement between women who have gone off to study in the diaspora and are beginning to shape conversations differently, who have been trained. We have much more formally trained gender scholars than we used to have. And they are bringing new kinds of questions into the conversation. And they are reshaping, I think, a lot of ways in which we think about institutions, the ways in which we think about what is possible through formal politics. They are bringing into conversation, well, let me not say what ideas for the moment. Okay, so the spaces have changed, the conditions have changed in many parts of Africa, but particularly in South Africa. I think democracy itself has been an enabling factor, that's blown the lid off what could be said and not said. And so that's allowed new kinds of ideas to come to the fore. So this generational shift, I think, is absolutely crucial. We have a much more robust, unconstrained group of women who are prepared also to take on men and patriarchy where necessary, in ways that are no longer either respectful or respectable, and that has had its own sorts of tensions, but we can see that very clearly. In terms of the ideas, of course, what we're talking about here, women have been central to thinking about what kind of state we should have, across what kinds of states we should have across Africa, what type of laws we should have, what kinds, what is the relationship between community and individuals, particularly on the thorny issues of, how to involve, how to really genuinely bring together women's sense of personhood. Are women persons or not is a huge question in debates about African communitarian systems. For a long time, the response to those ideas was to say that feminism was not African, that it was not an indigenous discourse, and therefore to raise these questions was to bring into our conversation Western individualism. I think that feminist theorists and feminist activists have successfully countered that in many, intellectually conquered that, but not politically conquered that. Rejection in the same way that homosexuality and thinking about sex and sexuality were seen as not areas in which we respectable Africans should begin to have a conversation. That's also changed enormously. Sex and sexuality and the relationship between sex and sexuality and law and institutions is much more open and vibrant conversation now than it used to be, say, in the 1980s, when really you had a very virtuous discussion about the importance of nations and nationalism. We have a much less virtuous and therefore much more interesting conversation coming out of young feminists today who are questioning, for example, earlier notions that motherhood was the distinctive form of African feminism. Many more young, Black, queer feminists are beginning to say, well, if you make motherhood the center, what about women who don't want to have children? What about women who cannot have children? What about self-definitions that are really beyond the frame that can be encompassed in the idea of family in that narrow sense? What about other forms of family? How about other ways in which we might live together? And so I think feminism today is beginning to bring into play new ideas about the relationship between public and private. In the first theorizations, I think we were very careful to point out the flaws in the Western feminist notions of the distinctions between public and private, and to make the argument that in Africa, we did not have liberalism develop in the same way, nor did capitalism proceed in the same way as it did in Europe, and therefore we have different kinds of porous relationships between public and private. But today, the conversations about public and private are also about sexuality, which is, I think, a different set of issues. It's not surprising that in this last 20 years, the real efflorescence of work on feminism has taken place in areas that are outside of social science. So fiction, biography and memoir have suddenly exploded in women's writing. And I think there's a good reason for that. Part of the reason is that social science spaces, political science, remains very dominated still by men with very narrow conceptions. You can do, if you did a kind of a Google search or a keyword search and look at how many times men cite women's scholarship, how as opposed to how many times women cite men's scholarship. Very interesting exercise. I sometimes give that to students like look at footnotes, look at bibliographies, and do cross checks on who cites who. And it can tell you they see power in knowledge production very clearly when they have to do that. So that's one reason. But the other reason is that because feminism was considered to be somewhat tainted as a space for serious scholarly intersection, right? The exploration was the F word, and we had all these other words, gender activists, equality activists, all these sort of obscured ways of theoretical exploration. It stifled theoretical development, I think, except for a few little spaces on the continent. Codestria and its affiliates were one part of that much richer discourse. I think in South African debates, there was much more feminist theoretical work, but I think that generally the idea that feminism doesn't belong in Africa stifled debate. Now people and so people have turned to biographies and fiction as spaces in which to explore their experiences of being women and queer people on the continent. So that archive, I think, again, is one we have to think about how we engage it. What are the status of the claims that are made there? How do we engage fictional ideas? And not surprising that people like Chimamanda Adichie become the frontrunners for African feminism, what is seen as African feminism, right? Because they're speaking in an idiom and a register that appears to be somewhat liberated from the way in which in the formal university spaces and theory-making spaces, we remain constrained by patriarchal relations of power. So I'll stop there because Nick's already signaled me to stop, and we can come back to these questions.
I don't want you to stop you. I want you to keep going, but unfortunately, we have our fifth speaker, so we should get Eleni. But I think all the points you raised there are really fascinating. I think one of the points you raised there also runs through so much of what we're probably going to talk about in the next year, which is, you know, what counts as an African idea in ideology. You know, you were talking about feminism and gender, but I think when it comes to democracy, when it comes to freedom, when, you know, there are so many different sort of key terms and debates around what is and is not external and internal, endogenous and you know, I think that's going to be a really interesting set of conversations to have, because as you say, that conversation is often bound up with power and deliberate attempts to frame things in certain ways in order to be included or excluded from the debate. So it's not just a kind of neutral academic question, it's actually about the everyday kind of politics. Now we have a fifth speaker and another great speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Eleni Sentim-Zeleke, who's the Assistant Professor of African Studies at Columbia University. Many of you will know that she has an absolutely fabulous book out called Ethiopia in Theory, which really shows how theory can illuminate a case in a really important way. And I think she's going to speak to some of that today. She seems to be slightly in the dark, but that's okay. Her ideas will illuminate all of us. So Eleni, over to you. So we need you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so sorry, I'm in the middle of nowhere bush. I'm on Manda Island. You know, there's not proper lighting here. All the lights are using solar energy. So my situation is very precarious and my internet is really, really unstable, but hopefully we can get through this session together. Just bear with me if you don't hear what I'm saying. Hopefully I can, you can just ask me to repeat it or clarify during the Q&A. So yeah, so Nick, thanks so much for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here with all of these amazing scholars that work on intellectual history in Africa. When I was preparing my talk today, you know, I come from a very interdisciplinary background. I was not actually trained in African studies. I was trained in social and political thought. And so I was really trying to think about who were the most influential people in my training, you know, in terms of who also shaped the book, Ethiopia in Theory. And actually the first person that I came up with was Alfredo Sadfilo, who used to be at SOAS and who works on questions of pro-poor policy for the Global South. And I did a workshop with him about sort of pro-poor policy and development and the environment years ago. And for some reason that workshop has really stayed with me as I have developed my own sort of research interests. I sort of took that workshop as a young graduate student. And the other person that I think has been really important for me more recently is Fadi Bardowil and his book, Revolution and Disenchantment. And he's a Lebanese intellectual. He teaches at Duke, but he's written this book about the Lebanese, sort of Lebanese Marxism. And Fadi's book is really important for me because it's exactly the type of work that I imagined Ethiopian theory was in conversation with. So, with Alfredo's work, he kept me thinking critically about what institutions of freedom might look like if we took inequality and poverty seriously as the two most important axes through which to think about democracy. And then with Fadi's book, it resonated with me because it helped me to connect questions of poverty and inequality with questions of revolutionary change and why ideas matter in politics and in Ethiopia in particularly. So are you guys with me here? Are we?
We can hear you loud and clear. You're coming through.
Oh, amazing, good. So Fadi's book is concerned with a minoritarian tradition of critique amongst a generation of Lebanese Marxist intellectuals that were operating under an organization called Socialist Lebanon. And my book is concerned with the ways in which Ethiopian post-secondary students studying at home and in Europe and in North America in the 1960s and 1970s were exploring the relationship between social theory and social change within the project of building a socialist Ethiopia. And they wrote pamphlets, they had a journal, and much of what I look at in the book is the kind of pamphlets and journals that they were creating theory out of. And so I would say that my book is concerned with what Fadi actually calls the social life of theory. And I pose the question of how student intellectuals become the vectors of revolutionary theory, how they understood themselves as mediators between theory and practice, and also, the kinds of organizations that they wanted to build in order to enact this mediation. And in many ways, I would say that Ethiopian politics today is the result of this kind of process of these students thinking through revolutionary theory and positing themselves as mediators between theory and practice in many ways, although I would say there's been a huge sort of reversal of that since 2018. So in my book, I'm not actually interested in necessarily giving a kind of a priori account of how theory relates to practice. Rather, what I'm trying to show is how actors use theory as a way to reflect on their own situation and how the meaning of Marxist theory changes through the actual processes of people engaging with theory in order to address the particularities of their situation. So Fadi, in his book, he pushes back against the kind of work that has been sort of published in the wake of Edward Said's Orientalism. And a lot of that work posits Marxism as a kind of self-orientalizing, or you're still colonized, you're still using these Western frameworks, blah, 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 blah. And so a lot of that work also does that kind of culturalist thing where it posits sort of religious scholars and so on as somehow more authentically decolonized than Marxists. Particularly in a place like Ethiopia, you really find that tendency to sort of go back to, Guz and, the manuscript tradition in Ethiopia as something that is, more indigenous than what these students would be engaging in. And so the choice often is to see the intellectual in the global South either as a kind of comprador who is seduced by the oppressor, or is, on the other hand, authentically resisting the West within a kind of indigenous framework. And so I think both in my work, and I think inspired by Fadi in some ways, I'm trying to think about the ways in which Marxist theory is taken up by students in Ethiopia in multiple locations. These students are in multiple locations. It's part of a kind of cosmopolitan conversation. That theory is going back and forth in multiple directions, and it is engaging in kind of overlapping modes of translation. So I think my work is trying to pay attention to this struggle of a generation of thinkers in the 60s and 70s, and it's asking what are the questions that they pose, what are the answers that they pose, and what are the different excuse me, what are the different positions that they're arguing against or aligning themselves with. The point is to take theory seriously, and to think about how theory is mobilized to help fashion a political position on the ground. Sorry? Are we, oh, sorry. Again, this is why it's important to talk about the social life of theory, and how ideas become part of a lived reality. So I do insist on engaging the people I'm studying on the terms that they set out for themselves. But at the same time, I think I felt very alone when trying to understand the relationship between sort of group identity or collective identity, communitarian identities, and revolutionary practice in Ethiopian Marxist circles. And this is because group identities have been debated under the rubric of the nationalities question in Ethiopia. And it can easily fall into the trap of becoming an instrument of rule. And in some ways, what I found when I was engaging the student movement literature and thinking about the aftermath of the student movement in Ethiopia was, I was thinking of that one of the problems with the student movement is that it didn't really create a reflexive sociological tradition that would allow me to think beyond the nationalities question as an instrument of rule. And in fact, when, in reading the Marxist literature in Ethiopia, I would say that the students remain committed to a certain kind of Marxist historicism. And when those Marxists became disenchanted with revolution and with their own sort of, linear understanding of Marxist history, of Marxist texts like Jairus Banerjee to the Frankfurt School. And, part of that was a way to get out of the dichotomy between sort of liberal theory and dogmatic Marxism. So what I ended up arguing is that Ethiopian Marxism was not a passive recipient of a kind of universal Marxism, nor was it simply a kind of peripheral conversation that, was a stage to something that was going to come later. Instead, it was actually engaged in struggle about the present, and that the present was the horizon of the political. And because the present was the horizon of the political, what we see is that theory itself is what gives us, the present in a way. And I suppose that's why I end up calling the book Ethiopia in Theory. It's like theoretical practice or political analysis is what gives us our present and allows us to think about all the different kind of random things that are happening in our lives. It produces some sort of coherence in our lives. So just to say then that for me, the nationalities question or ethnic politics is not a matter but I think what needs to be charted is the ways in which complex historical conjunctures characterized by things like, what Shireen was talking about earlier, capitalist penetration, that's not quite the kind of capitalist penetration we're used to in the West, coupled with modernist reform and colonial encounters, have actually led to sort of bottom-up ethnic, communal, and nationalist solidarities. So, at the same time, if I'll, to come back to Alfredo's work, then Alfredo Sadfilo, what is important for me is, again, to think about how questions of political economy then are connected to the ideational forms through which groups of people come to make decisions about how we live together, how they live together, and how they produce together. I have a whole, another 2 pages here that I've written notes to myself about the, relationship between the history of capitalism and sort of Marxist theory, but I'm going to skip that actually, and I'm not going to bore you with that for now. Maybe we can get back to that in the Q&A. although I do think I'll just say that it's really important for us to sort of pay attention to the ways in which, you know, capitalism has a very different history in a place like Ethiopia, and the ways in which capitalism interacts with the ethnic, with the customary, you know, with the local, and how that shapes demands for decentralization or modernization, promotion of ethnic autonomy, or, you know, kind of wider sort of nationalism. And that I, you know, part of what I think the student movement from the 60s and 70s is trying to do is to really connect all of those questions together, and not take its not take its neutrality for granted, and not assume the kind of position of, you know, the bourgeois social scientists who, you know, can take up the position of sort of neutrality and just like make discernments on society, but really place themselves within the society and try and think about the problems of that society. And in that sense, I think that they help us to think of a path out of a social science that maybe is happening from above, and gives us an example of what a social science from below might look like, and maybe helps us think about paths out of some of the stale dichotomies that govern sort of social science practice on the continent today. So I'll end there. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That was great. And the sound was pretty good for almost all of it. So I think all of your key messages got across there, which is really important. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of you here, and it's really great to see. We had over 120 people have come through the call. We had 250 people registered. Over 400 of you have joined the network, which is really wonderful. And we've gone a little bit longer than we planned. So I think what we should do now is encourage some questions from the audience to get you guys engaged. And then what we'll do is we'll go to the panel to both respond to what they've said and to the questions, and to finish up with a discussion amongst themselves, because I think it's better to bring the audience in now rather than sort of making you wait for another 20 minutes. So I see a great question in the chat that goes to Francis. AO, is that you, Adiola? I don't know if it is. Would you like to unmute yourself, turn your video on, and ask Francis the question yourself, or I can read it out the chat, but it would be nice to have someone actually read the question out. Because there's a lot of you, and I know there's going to be a lot of questions, please do keep them questions, and please do keep them punchy. What we'll do is we'll take a round of questions. So panelists, please do note down anything that you want to respond to, and then I'll go to our panelists who can then respond to whatever bits and pieces they think is most relevant. So who would like to ask the first question? Please, if you want to use the raise your hand function, go to reactions in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, click reactions and then raise hand, and then I will come to you one by one. I see you, Mohammed. Please answer your question.
Thank you for allowing me to have a question. My name is Mohammed. I'm author of the book called Why Somalia Does Not Go the Right Direction. Come to my question. I would love to have a question, Shireen. Why do you think African leaders not empowering for the women, and they always trying to abuse women when it comes for political, and how women can have equal right in politics in Africa? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. Dr. Serafin Camden, please unmute yourself, turn your video on and ask your question.
Sorry about the video. I'm not sure it's working. So I'll just ask the question quickly if you don't mind.
That's fine.
It's a very simple question. I've been writing about it in the chat. How should African scholarship, African studies, all what we are doing, the fantastic people of this panel, how can we go beyond the initial agenda of describing ideology, critically analyzing them? How can we go beyond that? Because we are already doing that, and influence ideologies in Africa towards significant and deep social change. How do we change the way people think. And in my chat, I will not read it again, I've given a very clear case about language ideologies. What do parents think that English can do to their children? But is it informed? Because these are systems of beliefs. So once I've described that, how do we, you, me, everybody here, how can we work to influence those ideologies? I don't want to use a strong term like change the ideology. Let's be very conservative and say, how can we work to influence ideologies in the African context? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And along with that, I'll piggyback my question onto yours because it's quite similar. My question was going to be, how do we actually understand what it is that changes and shapes the way that people think and ideologies and ideas? So Emma, you're talking about a very specific period of time in Tanzania. Eleni, you were talking about a very specific time there in Ethiopia. What are the sorts of things that actually shape how ideas and ideologies evolve over time in the particular periods that you're looking at? What are the key driving factors? Okay, I sort of think about this as a comparative political scientist, and that might not be the most useful way, but I'm really interested in why, we at certain periods in time, we have very many competing ideas, and some of them seem to win out and become, very attractive, very much capturing people's imaginations, and some of them don't. I'm really intrigued in your cases about the sorts of factors that you think shape that. I'm going to read out the question from the chat because the questioner hasn't put their video on to ask it. So this is for you, Francis. And I want to say, Francis, I'm reading the question. It's not my question in case you don't like it. So my question goes to Francis. Your paper, Incompleteness, is one of the papers that has influenced me the most. However, he says, I get lost at your conclusion. Are you calling for interdisciplinary approaches to academic enterprises, or are you calling for Africans to have a good blend of colonial heritage and traditional African cultural values? Please help me with your conclusion. So that's for Francis. We're going to take a few more questions, and then once we've got to a point where kind of everybody's got something to respond to, I'll come back to the panel. Helen, I see you there. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. Shireen, thanks very much for your talk. My question's for you. How can the feminist movement in Africa challenge patriarchal and institutional structures, including the law, for instance, and in a way that listens to women's voices more effectively to produce positive change? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you very much. Martin Luther, I see you. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. My name is Martin Luther, and I'm a PhD student, Aston University in Birmingham here. So mine is centered on the concept of African ideology. I keep hearing that term and that concept, but to be honest, it's not clear to me. And my question is not targeted to any of the speakers in particular, but anyone can take on it. What exactly is African ideology? And I'm saying this in respect to our brand of politics
$300
or governance, in economics, in education, in any area of the African life. What exactly is African ideology? Can anyone conceptualize it for me, please?
Thank you, man. I'm delighted that someone else in Birmingham has joined us, and it's great to have PhD students asking questions. So thank you so much for that. Just to say, we're going to take a few more. So if you've got a question for this brilliant panel, please raise your hand now. I can't really, there's too much in the chat to be able to follow the chat. So please raise your hand rather than putting it in the chat. We'll take a few more, then we'll come to the panel. And panel, just so you know, I'll come to you in the order in which you spoke. Abbas, I see you. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, hi, thanks. My question is to Mr. Oloruntoye Falola, and I may have missed it earlier because I had some technical issues. But my question ultimately is, if there's so much value in indigenous epistemology and transferring them into political ideologies, why have we seen so few Nigerian leaders today take advantage of that? Because to the best of my knowledge, the only individual who has done so is Rabiu Kwankwaso of Kano State. But if we look at many other elite level politicians in Nigeria, they haven't actually done so. Thank you.
Thanks, that's a good challenging question. Thank you very much. Ayrton, I see you, please unmute yourself.
Hi, and thank you for letting me asking my question. So I heard some of you speaking about the social context where ideas are produced. And I was wondering about the social context of the concerning the reception of ideas, and especially the today's social context, you know, with the idea that with technical issues, ideas would matter less. So what's your take on this context of reception of ideas? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great. And final question, Idris, I'm delighted you're asking one. So over to you, Idris, and this will be the final question, and we'll go back to the panel. So Toyin, we're coming to you after this one. Idris, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very excited from the beginning. I joined this opportunity of joining African scholars and other scholars across the globe. And I love the aspects where, I'm sorry for this thing, I forgot her name, where the professor that talk on issue of gender talk about knowledge production in Africa, and also the first presenter that talk about the democratic landscape also in Africa, tracing the history of Usman Dan Fodio in Nigeria. So my question is, what can Western world scholars and other African scholars living in abroad, what can they do in helping the young academics, researchers, especially from Africa, in leveraging the wide gap that created between us in Africa and those in the Western world, especially the barriers when it comes to the English proficiency at time of requirement for some of the young academics to join PhDs or to join any research-based organization or postdoctoral studies in various universities abroad. And I think this is another huge gap, or let me say limitation, that affecting the young scholars as well as academics pursuing different researches and different disciplines across the globe. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for those really good questions. Oh, I see one more, Kenna. Okay, we'll take you if you can make it very quick, and then we'll go to our panel. So Kenna, please.
Yeah, I'll make it brief. Thank you so much for this wonderful platform, and I really enjoyed the whole conversations today. My question is actually to Professor Oloruntoyin, and he made mention of Uthman Dan Fodio, whose jihad in 1804 led to probably the modern northern Nigeria that we have today. So my question is, where would you situate Uthman Dan Fodio in the history of Africa, in the history of Nigeria today? Where would you situate him in the history of Nigeria today, you know, with regards to his contribution to socio-political development of northern Nigeria? My name is Ikenna Steve Nweke. I'm from the University of Tsukuba, Japan. I'm a PhD student. Thank you so much.
Great, it's a real pleasure to have so many PhD students here today. Great question as well. So we're going to go in the order in which people spoke. So Toyin, first you, and then I think just to remind the panelists, then to Emma, then Francis, then Shireen, then Eleni to bring us home. So please maybe take 4 or 5 minutes each. Toyin, over to you first.
Thank you very, very much. The question and answer period is usually the best because it allows every speaker to fully understand whether they understand him or her, whether they grasp what he's saying, and whether the conversation is worth the time. And all the questions suggest that this panel today, this session, is worth having. And if you review all the questions, they are on the uses of ideas, which is terrific. The relevance of ideas, which is terrific. When you conglomerate, cumulate uses and relevance, they are gesturing us towards intellectual liberation, rethinking politics, rethinking power. And in both, specificity says, how do you question patriarchy? against the context of gender imbalance and feminism, how do you rework the past into the present? And what is the enduring value of, say, Uthman Dan Fodio? And what issues of label, framing, what is African ideology? That's an important question. And how do we frame it as such? In cumulating them, I will say, let me start with the last question. You cannot understand Northern Nigeria. You cannot understand the emergence of Northern Nigerian political parties without the caliphate. Whereas in the South, there is a lot of emphasis on personalities. In the North, a lot of emphasis on regionalism. And the conversation in Nigeria is always that the Fulani are dominating the space. And anytime you say that, you are returning to the caliphate and the platform created by the jihad. One of the things we've not done successfully, and I wrote an essay many years ago, the past in contemporary politics. By disconnecting them, we are making a mistake. Check, you cannot understand Zuma without understanding Shaka Zulu. How in the process of South African state capture, some began to see Zuma as a king, as a Zulu king, and some began to see it as a modern president. And that raises profound epistemological questions. The most dramatic was a governor of Kano State. When he was arrested for stealing money, they found the money in his house. And in his defense, he said, government money in governor's house, is that stealing? He was saying it as a very serious epistemological idea. How can you accuse the governor of putting state money in the governor's lodge that you cannot call it theft? Behind that statement, which many ridiculed, are the bigger ideas of conventions and constitutions. We study constitutions. We don't study conventions. Conventions that come from the past of African politics and ideas. There is hardly any African president that does not govern his space via convention. So why do you call Obasanjo Baba instead of president? If you go to the seat of power, and I've been privileged to have seen some of them, they are not governing you just through the agencies of modern constitutions. They're also governing you through the agencies of conventions. And you see it in the academy. If you go to Nigeria, if somebody is a professor and you call him by his first name, he's going to get angry at you. Why? Because professorship and chieftaincy sometimes can mean the same thing to the person. Why are you calling me Nick? I am professor. And those conventions, we need to pay more attention to them and how that past works itself to the present. Second, there is no aspect of politics that we can fully capture without interrogating the translation. We don't translate, in which Western terminologies do not always translate effectively into local idioms. What do you mean by a governor? What do you mean by a president? What do you mean by the division of labor? If you see how finances are managed, Buhari cannot call the governor of Central Bank, bring 20 million to Aso Rock. He's not going to say no. That's not in the Constitution. That's not a constitutional issue. How can you disobey the governor of Central Bank? You saw it in jokes around Idi Amin, but they are not jokes. They are issues we do not fully interrogate their meaning and their application. On the one hand, we want democracy, we want all these Western institutions, but we forget that politics is local, politics has to be translated into idioms, and politics is essentially also grounded in culture. I was given 5 minutes, and I will make one last point. Influence, influence, influence. A political theoretician made the argument, dividing political space into gladiators and spectators. And as you see in the uprising in Sri Lanka, our spectators overwhelm gladiators. The role of spectators, sometimes we lump them as civil society. Sometimes we blame intellectuals like Nick and myself for not doing enough. We must begin to recognize how state capture has also undermined various elements of power, reduce some of what we do into dust, disregard intellectual production, disregard intellectual output. So as this union of ideas in African politics develop, part of our interrogation should be, how do we empower spectators? How do we empower them so that we are not just presenting voices, we are translating those voices into agency? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think you proved yourself right that the question and answer session is the best part of the event. Fantastic stuff. So I think we're now going over to Emma, and after Emma, we'll be coming to you, Francis. So Emma, you're...
Yeah, well, how to follow that? I think translating spectators into agents, I guess that gets at the heart in a way of perhaps how we could think about the role of researchers. So I suppose as a historian, that question of kind of direct influence, to me, I think I would see myself at one remove from that. But I think that what we can do is to recover, to do that kind of work of recovery, which provides intellectual resources to those acting in the present. And to take the example that the questioner who was asking about influence gave in the chat and in the contribution, that question of language, I think one of the things that's been really interesting to me has been tracing the long and deep history of debates in the 20th century over language, the pros and cons of Swahili as a lingua franca as opposed to English as a lingua franca, and the different arguments were put forward on each side, and the ways in which that that kind of set of arguments. There's a particular newspaper that it was published in Nairobi, but it was published in Swahili, and it was written across it was read across the East African region. The newspaper was Baraza, which was edited in the 60s and early 70s by Francis Khamisi, the Kenyan politician and journalist. And the debate over Swahili as a lingua franca was one that was constantly animating the letters pages of Baraza, with different arguments on each side. And in some ways, that's recovering those kinds of debates again can kind of help us to think about why these things are so important, why it animated people in the past, and provide that kind of intellectual resource for those acting in the present as well. And I think that would be also my sort of answer to the question that was asked about reception of ideas, which is, how do we study reception of ideas? It's really difficult to study reception of ideas in the past. But I think one of the ways in which in my work I've tried to do that has been through things like the letters pages of newspapers, with all of the caveats and provisos of the difficulties of doing that that I've referred to already. Nick's huge question about how do ideas change? Why do some ideas take root at particular moments and become excluded at particular moments? And some historians would give you a kind of always and forever answer to that. Well, it's the economy trumps, or finally big power politics is the answer. I think there's something about particular constellations of particular moments that mean we have to kind of answer that question in a different way for each particular setting. And I guess that's why I would urge more empirical research on particular moments. One of the projects that I'm involved in at the moment is thinking about ideas of East African regionalism, and why at a particular moment have ideas of East African regionalism been very powerful, when were they eclipsed, and how do they then reappear in particular moments. And I think we sort of have to ask those questions about specific case studies more than we can do it about a sort of a rule when thinking about the past. And then finally, the question from Idris Mohammed about access, about things like English requirements and so on. And I think that really comes back to the points that Shireen was making about the exclusionary nature of institutions of learning in so many ways, in terms both of what's considered an object of study, but also in terms of creating space for new research and for new developments. And I guess the answer is, technologies like this are amazing. The Zoom room, the fact that we are joining together from all over the globe, creates that kind of space in which we can take these discussions forward. And it's not the whole answer, but it's a really important part of the answer. So I guess yes to networks and more networks like this. So thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Emma. Francis, over to you.
Yeah. I would say if we take seriously the idea that incompleteness and mobility are universal, and that pertains to ideas, to people, to identities, and even to being African, it challenges us to seek to disabuse ourselves of a particular essentialist sense of what our disciplines are, what ideas and ideologies pertain to Africa, and what Africa is. And if we subscribe to take seriously again the idea of mobility and incompleteness as universal, then we should embrace impurities, disciplinary impurities, identities impurities, and not to see them as a problem. And we should also, as academics and as people who have curiosities about studying Africa, to seek to look for it in unlikely places, unfamiliar places, and not to freeze it within a particular geography and a particular set of ideologies, and use binary thinking to go with it. So the framework that I suggested initially about incompleteness and mobilities as universals would lead us to exciting ideas of what forms of encounters are possible, especially when those encounters are not consumed by the fixation with absolute victories or conquest. And we would then not be surprised to find an idea of being African that is almost like a patchwork, a composite of identities, where it is possible to be Africa dispersed across different geographies, bringing together influences across histories, across ethnicities, and in a way that is exciting and that provides an opportunity for us to think more in terms of convivial forms of being and belonging, either as African or anyone else. So if there's anything I would like to leave participants with today, it's the idea that we stand to be enriched and in our understanding of Africa and studying the continent if we see it within the framework of incompleteness and mobility as permanence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Shireen, coming to you now. You had quite a few specific questions there, so over to you.
Well, thank you. I want to underscore what Francis has said, because I also find that a much more appealing way to proceed, to think not in terms of, what is an African ideology, as if there was some tangible object there that we can define, and that somehow is distinctive across a continent of such great diversity and with such enormously different cultures, histories. I find the whole search for that sort of distinctiveness to be, something I find it hard to get my head around. And so my approach to theory, Francis, is I guess, like you, I would say my approach to theory is much more modest. It's not to say, how do we, what is this thing, this distinctive thing, and we're going to find it if only we empower languages, if only we did this. There isn't a single bullet that will do that. And so my answer to the one question is, well, how do we empower? What do we do for young scholars? I'm increasingly saying, to actually step away from critiquing Western philosophy, because that just feels like a way of remaining stuck, but rather to turn it around and ask, what is happening in our spaces? What are the concepts and the terms that will begin to describe and capture that, and to do that in conversation with how people might have thought about those, thought about institutions, may have thought about identities, political formations, movements in other places at other times, and have that kind of comparative context, but that we enter those conversations with knowledge about the spaces we live in and work in and struggle in and love in and imagine in, rather than from the abstracted space of how to, what is decolonial theory in this very broad way. In fact, so that of course is my bias of training as more of a political historian than anything else, right? I want to begin from there, and that means taking people seriously, taking how people live their lives and the ways in which they articulate what it is that is intention in their lives very seriously. And which brings me to the question of, why are African leaders not empowering women? Well, they're not empowering women for the same reason that they don't empower poor people. I think we must flip that question around. We must ask, what is it that people are demanding from below? Because leaders don't come to empower us. We take agency as human beings, and we craft in the conditions that are constrained, as Mark said, for all those reasons, but people push against constraints, reimagine. So I don't look to African leaders to empower anyone. They won't, because power works to defend itself. And that includes patriarchal power, right? Power closes in on itself. It's not going, to the extent that African leaders have sought to empower women, or even where women's demands from below for empowerment have translated into some kind of success. Take quotas for women.
Whoever that is, can you mute yourself, please? Thank you.
Take quotas for women in government. And in political parties, which you could say a reasonably successful strategy of the global women's movement, right? Look at that very closely, and what you will see is that at a certain point, it was very easy for African countries to expand the number of women in these formal places in government, because in fact, the real politics wasn't happening there. The real politics was happening somewhere else, right? So what is representation? What do we mean by it? We surely mean something much more than simply rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I would want to flip that whole question around, and Helen, I would say, to answer your question, then how could we challenge patriarchal institutions? Absolutely central question. I think we can only do that by organizing and mobilizing from below, and not waiting for this to come from the state. But in that process, I think, perhaps one area where I continue to have some conflict, tension, and debate with some young feminists that I work with today is that they want to throw out some big gains that have been made. So take the Constitution, right, which many young people in South Africa want to throw out because they see it as something that has been imposed from outside or above, Western compromise. And my response to that is, don't write off the entire 20th century history of poor people struggling from below for the rights to personhood. But don't expect that the Constitution will empower you. It's only a tool. It is what we make it. And it is about the future. It's about how we might make a future in which we, as Francis, you always put it so lyrically, Francis, in which we might have lived together in a convivial sense. That's an aspiration. It's not it doesn't exist, but how might we live together? For that to happen, we have some things in our toolkit that are already there that we need to build on, that we need to use. Why hasn't there been a serious challenge to the government's attempts, for example, in South Africa, to reduce the rights of women living in rural areas? We know that they constantly bring back these laws that will fundamentally take away, they give and take away. The law says, bring in laws that says we'll have 30% of traditional councils will be women. But what they don't do is say how women will have power and voice in those councils. Right now, essentially what they keep intact are systems that discriminate against women's ability to use land on their own terms. I suspect in the next 5 years that case is eventually going to hit the Constitutional Court. And thank heavens we have in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, a provision that women's rights trump the rights to tradition. I know there are huge constituencies of people who think that's a bad thing, that tradition is more important than the rights of human beings. In the here and now and in the future. But I think feminists are going to bring that challenge, and it will be interesting to see how those debates play out. So I don't have an easy answer. It's hard work, and it's work from below, and it's not expecting that those in power will cede power, because that just seems to me not going to happen.
Thank you so much. I love that this discussion is getting better and better and better as we go. Eleni, over to you for the final word. So take us home.
And the final word. I study a group of students that did, in fact, influence politics quite dramatically, and used the pamphlets and the journals that they were debating ideas to shape public policy and to shape a revolutionary agenda. And in many ways, they also used violence to achieve their ends. And I'm a little bit weary of the need to directly affect politics as an intellectual because of the people that I study. And I suppose what I was trying to raise in my presentation earlier is what might be a different role for the intellectual today, given that history of the student movement and its relationship to violence and revolution. And I suppose one of the questions that I'm also interested in is, what does it mean to embed yourself within the society that you live in, and to think about your questions as coming from that society rather than being an outsider, having better ideas than everybody else, and then sort of being able to discern something. I will also say, Ethiopia is at war, and what does it mean? What is the role of the intellectual when a country is at war is a question that I've really been asking myself. And I think the war is really about the past in contemporary politics, to use, Toyin Falola's phrase from earlier today, right? And it's really about the legacy in many ways of the student movement and people fighting about that legacy in some ways. So what is the role of the intellectual, and what is the relationship between theory and nonviolence as well, is a question that I've been asking myself. I myself, rather than trying to be to have influence in this war, have removed myself and come to the bush. And I've been here for 6 months to think about the war and to think about all of the kinds of histories that have gone into making this war today. And I'm doing that in Kenya, in northern Kenya, out of all places, to think about Ethiopia. And I'm posing that question for myself. What does it mean to think about the Ethiopian Civil War as an African civil war from Kenya? And that's a practical question and a philosophical question. But it's also a question about, removing myself is also a question about nonviolence as well, and the relationship between theory and nonviolence. So I think that's something that we need to think about a bit more as African intellectuals, because I think there's actually a relationship between intellectual activity in Africa and violence that we haven't really been very good at explaining. And I think we should maybe explore that more as part of the history of ideas on the continent. I guess lastly, then I would, I really want to emphasize that I don't think democracy is a Western concept. I don't think ideas of mutual recognition and freedom are just like Western concepts. And what does it mean to build those institutions from the ground up, or, things that we need to think about in terms of actually having a history on our continent. In that sense, I'm really charmed by this idea of incompleteness, citizenship as incompleteness, citizenship as mobility. And I guess the only thing I would say about that is, how does it connect back to questions of political economy, that shape the lives of everyday people on the continent today? That was a bit rambly, but that's what I have to say.
wasn't rambly at all. Was fantastic, and you ended with a question, which is how all good events should be. You posed a question for us there. What do academics and scholars and theorists and intellectuals do in times of war? Was your question. We could pitch it a bit broadly in times of crisis, because many of us are living in countries with one crisis or another. And I think we try and do what all of you have done brilliantly today, which is, to speak truth to power, to be willing to ask difficult questions, and to try and offer clarity, even if clarity means greater complexity. I think we've had 5 absolutely brilliant presentations. We couldn't have had a better launch event for the network. And I think we've also had a load of really great suggestions of what to do. Toyin has suggested that, we put together a series of great kind of publicly accessible lectures on key topics. We've had loads of fantastic suggestions for future shows in the chat. If you haven't been checking out the chat, panelists, there's loads of great comments, a lot of praise for your speeches and your discussions, but also a lot of great ideas in the chat, which suggests that there's a level of real engagement amongst our audience today. So thank you to everyone who's joined us. It's fantastic. If you're not already a member of the network, please do send an email to ideasinafrica@gmail.com. The team will get it. If you send your name and your affiliation and your interests, we'll add you to the list. You'll get information about the next event. Do feel free to send suggestions for future shows there. But as we said, this will be not the end, but the first of many conversations, maybe picking up on the great question that Eleni just posed us, but also some of the other things today, I think, around, what does it mean to have an African idea or ideology? Francis's great ideas around, incompleteness, Prof. Fola's great ideas that, have inspired us. And I think it's great that we also have kind of works that think through really carefully the role of ideas and ideologies in different periods of time, such as Emma's and Lainey's. So it's real pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much to everybody for coming. And we will make the video available. It will be available on Democracy in Africa, be on YouTube. Everybody will be sent the link and you can post it wherever you would like. And obviously, please do share this, with people who you think would be interested in this debate. One of the ideas of the network is to create more publicly available material that everybody can tap into and access for free as we move forwards. So I think it's really important that we try and share these materials as widely as possible to break down some of the knowledge barriers that people have talked about, and Shireen and others have been, commenting on, both in terms of, income and in terms of gender and in terms of class and location. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here, especially for sticking it out for now almost 2 hours. That's heroic and demonstrates real commitment to our cause. And look forward to seeing everybody at an IDAP event soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you very much. It was great.
Take care, Shireen. Take care, everyone. It was really great.
Thanks.
Really
Bye.
love listening to you all.